Alrighty then, everybody. Hello, welcome to the Alex Cuesta Show. Hope everybody is doing well on this Wednesday, September 14th of 2022. Before we get into any of the fun stuff, like, share, follow, subscribe, rate 5 stars on Spotify and iTunes. Spread this word of mouth and go find us on the socials. Just go search the Alex Cuesta Show. We'll be there. I am here as always with David. Hi, Dave.
Hola. Hola. I am okay. I had an interesting week one of the NFL season. I got to go to the Jets home opener on 9/11. It was a very good experience, but the game itself wasn't a good experience, but we might talk a little bit about that, so I don't want to jump directly into it yet.
Yeah, so I'm going to give a little bit about this episode because it's a little bit different than what we have done. So this weekend on Saturday evening, I believe it was, I recorded a interview with John Ziegler. Now, if you don't know who John Ziegler is, he is a documentary filmmaker that made a film about 9/11, which is interesting that you went to the game on 9/11. He made a documentary about 9/11. He is also an individual that has now dedicated the last 10 years of his life since 2021. So 10 years before that. So since 2011, 2012, investigating what happened during the Penn State Scandal. So now those that don't know, that have been under a rock, 10, 11 years ago now, sports world was rocked. Joe Paterno just became the winningest coach in NCAA history. And it came down on that his longtime defensive coordinator, who had been retired for years at that point, Jerry Sandusky, was indicted by the grand jury for sex crimes, being a pedophile. The whole world was shook. Honestly, Dave, you were a little young for this. I don't know how much you remember of the whole Joe Pa thing. You probably did because I was very active in sports. Adele, my mother, your mother, Adele, she likes sports. So she likes sports more than our father does. Mm-hmm. And we were all very in tune to this. Our cousin was at Penn State. She went to Penn State. A lot of this stuff going on. So all that went down, and it did shock the world. Now, what came out of it was the whole entire country. To this day, you could probably find anyone that knew about that, including myself before I discovered this, Dave, probably you, convinced that Jerry Sandusky is a pedophile, is rightfully rotting in prison, and the people that he abused and victimized are now getting their, just desserts for what occurred to them. John Ziegler had a different take. He did investigation, starting off with finding out if Joe Pa was innocent, because Joe Paterno was framed, it seems like, involved in that. And he went on from his discovery to finding out what he claims that Jerry Sandusky is an innocent man. He made a 19-episode, 24-part podcast, 19-part, 24-episode podcast series that released last year about it, called With the Benefit of Hindsight, which I am currently rocketing through right now because I did not finish it. But it's extremely interesting, worth the listen. Dave, you listened to the show. You listened to the interview. We talked initially about I'm going to call it the Duke BYU hoax. That's what it's going to be named from now on. The Duke BYU hoax that occurred 2 weeks ago. We talked about that. And then we jumped into the Sandusky with the Benefit of Hindsight podcast. You listened to the show. Give your impressions of what the show, what you thought about the show, and then we will give way and you guys can listen to that interview.
Isn't it funny how multiple hoaxes have had to do with Duke? One where it's perpetrated against Duke lacrosse, and the other where it's it's still against Duke. Yeah, and very interesting.
That they're the little, the pigs that are getting slaughtered.
Yeah. Either way, I will say the show was very interesting. John Ziegler is a very good guest. He knows a lot. He's been doing this for a long time. And just the fact of the matter is that he released something on a story that happened many moons ago, just last year, in order to fully flesh out what happened, what probably happened. Because I haven't listened to the show yet. I've only listened
with the benefit of hindsight. Yeah.
Yes, I haven't listened to that. So I don't know everything that he went over, but I know that during your interview with him, and he's completely correct in this. He said that he needs to make sure everything is intact, everything is fully realized in order to basically prove the case that Sandusky is more or less innocent.
No. He doesn't say more or less.
No,
John Ziegler says definitively that Jerry Sandusky is an innocent man, which is a huge leap and a huge place to stand.
Yeah.
In this day and age.
He actually did. Yeah, he did specifically say not guilty, not that. No, actually innocent.
Yeah.
So yeah, but that is a Herculean task, possibly more than Herculean, in order to do that, especially with public conscience already, as you said, basically saying, okay, well, Sandusky is a pedophile. Like everyone basically believes that if you heard the story.
Yes.
And I mean, I remember when I was younger, I didn't really know that much about it because I didn't care that much about it. But I did care about the Joe Pa angle, mainly because it was really weird to me, especially because they're like, oh, we're going to take away the wins he had and stuff like that. There was a whole controversy about taking away the things he earned for Penn State during his tenure there because of this controversy. Yeah. Even me at a younger age, I was like, wasn't that stupid? Like that still happened. No matter, you can take that history away as much as you want. It still happened. There's not someone else didn't win those titles. They didn't have that record. That just makes no damn sense. But I guess even seeing from there the things that were happening, it all should have probably smelled a little bit. But I am interested in listening to In the Benefit of Hindsight now. I do actually want to find out what he uncovered, because I know you have told me that he is all the interviews that he had with the people throughout the years about this topic is actually raw, unfiltered on, I don't remember the website.
I think it's framingpaterno.com is his website. Let me double check that. So,
yes. Yeah. But either way, having those interviews, no edits, is incredible for anyone to listen to. And
framingpaterno.com is where you'll go, and it's all it's a very blank initial website, but if you go on the top bars and you click on all the things like original videos and stuff, there's a bunch of things there. So
yes, and to me, what a lot of this tells me throughout the whole entire interview you did with him, both with Duke BYU hoax and with the Sandusky trial and everything that happened, is that we need to understand that people are perfectly okay lying to you to get what they want done. And it doesn't have to be always the journalist. A lot of time it is, but it doesn't have to be always the journalist. I mean, he brought up how one of those in power in Penn State, not the highest power in Penn State, but one of those in power did not like Joe Pa. He had certain reasons for not liking Joe Pa, and then that's probably the reason. He did say a speculation, but it's probably the reason why he pushed
VP of the board.
Yep, why he pushed for certain things to happen.
Yep.
So we do have to come to this understanding that people not only will lie to you, but do want to lie to you in order to push whatever narrative or whatever thing that they're trying to sell you. And this isn't a new thing. This has always been a thing. It has always been a thing. Yet again, going back to the Sandusky case, going back to Duke lacrosse, going back, and you can go even farther and farther back. It's not like, everyone used to be good in the media before. That's completely untrue, and that's just dumb to think. Yeah. Most of the time, people were still lying to you. In fact, it's incredible now that at least we have the internet so we can see how much they are lying to us in general.
Yep.
And I don't know. Did it really get worse? That's a question to ask yourself as well. But that's what this. I'm not going to lie. That's what this
they do talk about with the benefit of hindsight. They do talk about the media angle on all the social media stuff. So I can't recommend more going to listen to that podcast. You mentioned that he interviewed people. When I tell you he has hundreds of hours of interview time, he interviewed basically everyone, as many people as he could from all angles over the 9-10 years. I didn't mention that in the show, but the Paterno family, the Sandusky family, of people, friends of the alleged victims. And I'm going to continue now to say alleged victims, because of what I heard, they are not victims, they are alleged victims at this point, because it needs to be retried. I'm at least at that point where we need to get a retrial for Jerry Sandusky. So that's the point that I'm at right now. Dave, before we jump into it, anything else that you want to
add? No, not really. For the most part, thank you for your work, John Ziegler, because not many people would step up to the plate like this, obviously, and thankfully you're one of the people that actually want to do genuine work on interesting topics, and especially if you're saying Sandusky is innocent. Really a topic of justice, honestly. Yep. If Sandusky is an innocent man, then this is terrible. It's a terrible thing that happened. It's just an absolutely terrible thing that happened.
And credit to his co-host of the podcast, Liz Habib, who goes in there very skeptical. And as you listen to the episode, she's getting more and more convinced as well. Mm-hmm. Credit to her as a journalist for going in there open-minded and being willing to have her mind changed, because it takes a lot to basically try to ruin your own career by saying Jerry Sandusky's innocent or being associated with an individual that's willing to say that. Mm-hmm. So, all right, everybody. Without any further ado, here is my interview with John Ziegler, senior columnist, talk radio host, documentary filmmaker, and host of the With the Benefit of Hindsight, the true story of the Penn State Scandal. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back next week. Enjoy the interview. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Alex Cuesta Show. I want to thank everyone for being here. With me, I have an individual that has worn many hats in media and has done a lot of things over a long career. He's a senior columnist, talk radio show host, documentary filmmaker, an author, and he was the host of a podcast series that premiered last year, With the Benefit of Hindsight, the true story of the Penn State Scandal. John Ziegler, what's up, John? Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited here because we got a lot to talk about. I sure want to touch on that podcast series because I've listened to a good amount of it. I still have to finish it, I must admit, but it's really interesting, and I think it'll open a lot of people's eyes. And the first topic I want to touch on, though, is something that I think I saw from you. You've had a long career in doing this type of stuff, especially in sports and in politics. And I feel like your nose kind of perked up to kind of noticing, for lack of a better terms, bullshit when you see it happening. And recently, last week, during a Duke BYU sold-out women's volleyball game, there was an accusation thrown out by a Black Duke player, volleyball player, that every time she was serving, there was a racial slur thrown at her. Long story short, BYU sided completely with the player. They pointed out somebody based off their voice, not even by looks. The individual happened to be, I believe, have Asperger's or an autistic individual, somebody on the spectrum, and they ended up kicking this individual out for life because of it. Now, you were one of the first people I saw, because I see your tweets. You're one of the first people I saw on Twitter going, let's pump the brakes on this and let's kind of find out the facts, and we're rushing to judgment here. What was your instinct when you first saw this story? Kind of talk me through like why you were kind of on the like, hey, hold on here with this.
Well, as you've already alluded to, this was not my first rodeo. I have sniffed out stories like this many times before in many different areas of life. And I've actually come up with a pretty almost foolproof formula for figuring out whether or not a story is at least questionable, if not totally false. And that formula is this. You take an accusation and you look at the amount of evidence that you would expect there to be if the story was true. And you give that value a number from 1 to 10. And then you divide that number by the amount of evidence that is actually in play, that actually is in existence. So that gives you a number, the amount of evidence you expect versus the amount of evidence that actually exists, that you divided by that, and then you have a number. Then you take that number, whatever it is, this sounds silly, but it works. You then take that number and you multiply it again on a scale of 1 to 10 on how much or by how much the news media wants that story to be true. And if you get a number that is over, say, 25, that's usually where my threshold is. If it's over 25, the story is almost surely not true. And this story, right out of the gate, was a 45.
Oh, Jesus.
And for comparison's sake, Jussie Smollett, which, by the way, I don't get, in my opinion, nearly enough credit for this. I was the first mainstream writer to write that I believed, and that the Chicago police believed, that Jussie Smollett was a lie. I did that for Mediaite. You can Google that. But Jussie Smollett was a 50. So this was a 45. Jussie Smollett was a 50. And so I knew right off the bat that this story was likely false. And I guess the two things that were most glaring to me were, one, the timeline. The timeline on stories like this and how they break is everything. And this is, I don't think the average person who's not in the media or doesn't think about media issues, doesn't have the experience of someone like me. I've been a failure in virtually every aspect of the media. So I know the media better than they know themselves, as Rush Limbaugh used to say. Only in my case, it's actually true, because I've done a lot of different things, many more different things than Rush ever did. But the timeline is critical. And this timeline was highly suspect. The first part of the problem with the timeline is the story does not break during the game or even immediately after the game. It is so important. It's so important to understand how absurd that is. If you always have to, you have to presume. I do this in every story I evaluate. I'm going to presume everything that's being alleged is true. And if everything is being alleged is true, then what is the possibility that nobody would have talked about this, or this in an internet age, in a Twitter age, this would not have become public knowledge immediately with video, firsthand accounts, a press conference by the player, and all sorts of things would have happened the night of the game.
Not to mention,
did not happen.
The game was apparently sold out. It was a packed, important game over at BYU. So not to mention, it was a sold out event. So yeah, you saying that somebody would have been live streaming an individual yelling racial slurs at a black player in this day and age is absolutely highly probable if that was actually occurring.
Right. And by the way, and I agree with that. I mean, I said on the Glenn Beck show that This is basically akin to Bigfoot deciding to sit in the BYU student section and no one taking any video of Bigfoot. So in the real world, that's impossible. But I'm willing to go even further than that, because it's not just there's no video. There's no allegation made publicly by the player. That does not happen. And by the way, it doesn't happen Friday night. It doesn't even happen Saturday. On Saturday, this becomes a major news story. Why? Not because the player put out a video statement declaring what had happened, or even a written statement or a tweet. No, someone claiming to be the player's godmother. Now that word godmother is important, because I mean, look, I'm not suggesting there's no relationship between the two of them. I'm sure they're close, but godmother, which is in most situations pretty informal, you could claim to be a godmother to almost anybody if you wanted to be. That is a phrase you use when you are trying to give yourself standing in a story, right?
That's like
not the mother.
Like when you have a family friend that you're just like, oh, they're the aunt or the uncle because they're that close type of deal. It's
right.
A similar thing to that.
Right. And again, I'm not suggesting there's no relationship. I'm suggesting that word, it didn't register as a 10 for me on a red flag, but that word was about a 3, maybe a 4 red flag. But the bigger red flag was the picture in the tweet where the godmom alleges that that her goddaughter was subjected to the N-word, very specifically, the N-word every time she served. That's what it said. Every time she served, and then was subjected to racial intimidation by a white man. Okay, now that's horrendous, and that's why that went viral, and that's why LeBron James tweeted it, which was really what sparked the whole fire. But in that tweet, if you remember the media, you used to ask questions or think critically. You would look at that tweet and you would go, okay, well, first of all, the first question I have is, why is this on Saturday, not Friday? My second question is, why is it the godmom, not the player, that's saying this, or Duke that's saying this? And then number three, the photograph that the godmom uses in the tweet is of her and her goddaughter, but it's not from the game. It's from them clearly in a non-volleyball situation, obviously, and it's an older picture. Why is that significant? That told me immediately she wasn't there.
And if I'm not mistaken, isn't the godmother running for political office?
Well, that would have been number 4.
Go ahead, I'll let you finish up.
The fourth thing about that tweet is, if you look at her Twitter feed, she's currently running for political office. And then number 5, which I didn't even get to because someone else found this a day or two later. If you look at her past tweets, she had literally dozens of tweets that if she was white and was tweeting about a black person would be considered openly racist. Now, those are 5 major problems, at least, with the tweet. And the media didn't even bother to ask any questions about any of them. They just rubber stamped it. And then it wasn't until Sunday, again, the timeline is everything, Sunday, when Rachel Richardson releases a statement written. Now, I'm always very wary of written statements because, obviously, it's very easy to write anything you want to write. Saying it, there's different levels of statements, right? Make a live video with a cynical questioner would probably be the most credible way to do something.
Yep.
A written statement is probably the least credible way of doing something because there's no one vetting you. And
did you even write it?
Yeah, did you even write it? You can take as much time as you want to come up with it, whatever you say. And to me, when I read the statement from Rachel Richardson, I knew I was right because she doesn't say anything about the N-word. She then refers instead to racial heckling. And that phrase to me was dripping with BS because there's no way to disprove. First of all, when you're not specifically saying what was said, you can't disprove it, right?
It's so vague. It's a tactic that the left loves to use. And I'm not saying whether Rachel is or I don't care about her political ideology.
She's definitely very. She herself is very liberal too. She herself has tweets and has liked tweets that are very, very much in the category of a racial activist, woke liberal type of person.
And especially the woke. They use a bunch of vague terms that if you go against, all of a sudden, well, you hate this. And it's like, no, I don't hate your vague generality. I hate when you get into detail and it's completely wrong. But they like to use these vague terms, these big general universal things that everyone can agree with, and then all of a sudden go off the hill with it.
Well, let me go. This term racial heckling is really important because when you understand the context and the timeline of how this all went down, a very different narrative and scenario to me becomes very clear. See, here's what I believe happened. Okay. And I don't know this for a fact, but this scenario makes a hell of a lot more sense and is backed up by a lot more evidence than the narrative that the media immediately bought.
I probably trust you more than the godmother. I'm not going to lie.
I appreciate that. I was also not at the game, but I think you and your listeners will find this scenario far more plausible. So Rachel Richardson is playing in a very hostile environment in BYU, where she had never played before. It is a unusually hostile environment for a women's volleyball game. It was a packed house, a record crowd. She stunk out the joint. She played terrible, and Duke lost. So as she's now, whether there was a complaint during the game of some level is still, in my view of the evidence, uncertain. There is evidence that a police officer was at the Duke bench, but that's not that unusual for that to happen in an athletic contest. So I'm going by the evidence we have. Is it possible that she complained about the crowd yelling too loud or something? I don't know. I guess that's possible. But the essence of what I think happened is this. She was looking for an excuse for how poorly she played. She tells her dad, who was also not at the game, she tells her dad that night that, boy, these white BYU kids were all over me. They were so mean. It felt like they were racially heckling me or something to
they
that.
Were probably extra hard on me because I'm black in that
all
white Mormon school.
Right. And so that's all. So then the dad, who is black, that's all he needs. He then talks to the godmom, and he takes Rachel's story, which is greatly exaggerated from the truth. He exaggerates it further. And then the godmom flat out decides to lie. And just decides, I'm going to throw the N-word in there because that's what's going to get attention. And so the N-word gets thrown in. LeBron James tweets it. The media jumps on board. BYU, and this is an incredibly important part of the equation. And this I am an expert in this area because I saw this happen in the Penn State case in spades, where academia, especially ironically enough, when that academic institution is run mostly by straight white males, which is the case in BYU, they are going to capitulate, self-flagellate. They're going to plead guilty to everything immediately because they're just trying to save their jobs. They know that in academia, there is no negative accountability for pleading guilty to things that didn't happen, as long as you're doing it on the PC side.
Yep.
So BYU immediately rushes the virtue signal and show how against racism they are by throwing their own people under the bus before there was any investigation whatsoever. So now we go back to the timeline. So Rachel Richardson doesn't say anything publicly Friday. She doesn't say anything publicly Saturday. By the time her written statement is out with this racial heckling thing on Sunday, BYU and the media have already made it clear they're blowing the wind at her sails. They are 100% on her side. So now what's she going to do? Her godmom is locked into the N-word. She doesn't want to say N-word because that's possible to disprove, and it didn't happen. So she probably felt badly about lying, but she's not going to shoot down the narrative because she's as invested as anybody is. And by the way, it's working for her because this fits her worldview. And by the way, I think it's even possible that by the time the whole world is saying this, she may even have come to believe that it happened.
Probably.
Because again, that term racial heckling is so vague and so easy. You know what racial heckling sounds like to me? That sounds like where we are getting incredibly close. And we are so much closer to this than the left will ever admit, where it is inherently racist to criticize a black person in any way, shape, or form. And to even negatively cheer in a sporting event against a black person by a mostly white crowd, that is inherently racist in the minds of a woke person. And Rachel Richardson is clearly in that vein based upon her tweets, her family background, the fact that she goes to Duke, the way she reacted to this. That statement was as much a political statement as it was a statement of what actually did or did not happen during that volleyball game.
Now, I'm losing the name and I forget the dumb book because I actually read the book. Unfortunately, I torture myself and I read the books of the things that I highly disagree with just because I believe in knowing the other side better. And I forget, I'm drawing a blank, but the author, she's a complete moron, but she's a white woman, and she said that it's not whether racism happened in that moment, but how did racism manifest itself. And the name is I'm going to probably look it up in a second because I can't remember.
Well, see, I actually think that I think the closer parallel here is to Oprah Winfrey's phrase, "your truth." Remember, Oprah came up with the idea of your truth as opposed to the truth, and that was when I knew I knew for sure I was right when BYU put out a second statement, because and I was thinking very much about Oprah's "your truth," because if I urge anyone, if you can find it, it's on my Twitter feed. The second statement put out by BYU, and I think this was on that Sunday, was so clearly written from the standpoint of an institution that didn't really believe this happened, but did not want to upset, one, the media, and two, make a black female who's now seen as a victim feel bad. They used words like the Duke players believed this happened. The Duke players' experience is what matters. The Duke players felt unsafe. So you have believed, experienced, felt. Those are words. I mean, whoever wrote that statement, I hope they got paid a lot of money, because they clearly
massaged it well.
Oh, they were, and I speak academic ease, so I'm able to interpret that statement. When I read that statement,
woke.
I speak woke. I knew that BYU no longer believed this happened. They just weren't willing to say that in a way that the media would interpret properly, or interpret in a way that would be negative. But it was so obvious to me at that point, okay, this story is bullcrap. How's it all going to play out? And it's played out a little more quickly than I anticipated. I'm mildly, pleasantly surprised by the way that BYU has now reversed course.
Yeah, I have the statement right here. Yeah.
And but I'm also as equally disappointed by the fact that Duke and Duke supporters have gone out of their way to continue to pretend to believe in the fairy tale because they don't want to make a black female feel bad. And that's the world we live in now, where the truth doesn't matter and people will hold whatever narrative is good for them. They're never forced to admit they were wrong because their cult will always back them. And in this case, it's the woke cult. It's the civil rights cult. It's the Duke cult. It's the sports media, ESPN cult. And it's dangerous. It's frustrating. It's sad. But it's emblematic of so much else that's going on in our culture.
It is. And I want to talk a little bit about the statement before I found it. It's Robert DeAngelo and White Fragility. That's who had that quote. And she's a psycho that talked about the whole entire racism manifesting thing. But I do have the statements in front of me. So I want to kind of, BYU is a little lengthy, so I'm not going to read the full thing. I'm going to kind of give it an excerpt. Duke's is quick and short and sweet and just basically says, we don't care what they said. We still are backing our player. But in essence, BYU came out and like you said, initially they said they banned an individual for life. They completely took the side of, the Duke player. But then they come out, and this was yesterday, and then it was updated today, apparently, that they reviewed all available video and audio recordings, including security footage, raw footage, all camera angles taken by BYU TV of the match, broadcasting audio removed to ensure that the noise from the stands could be heard more clearly, reached out to 50 individuals who attended the event, Duke Athletic Department personnel, student athletes, BYU Athletic Department personnel and student athletes, event security and management, and fans who were in the arena that evening, including many of the fans in the on-court student section where they accused an individual of saying this. And they basically said from this review, they can't corroborate that any racial heckling or uttered racial slurs were at the event. And then they went on to reiterate, we won't tolerate it. We stand against racism. They went through the whole entire thing to kind of CYA again. But That's basically saying that this was a fraud. This was a lie. So I do commend BYU because they did a lot more than most of these types of places, whether it's an institution or media outlet. And most of the time, they never actually follow through with an investigation. If the investigation didn't find what they wanted to find in terms of the racism, they usually just do like a little quick tweet excerpt or a small little thing, and that's it. They don't make a big deal out of it. BYU actually at least gave a legitimate statement here, but I just want to jump to Duke's statement, which is laughable. This one I'll read because it's a small little paragraph. This was from Duke University Vice President and Director of Athletics, Nina King. Quote, the 18 members of Duke University volleyball team are exceptionally strong women who represent themselves, their families, and Duke University with the utmost integrity. We unequivocally stand with and champion them, especially when their character is called into question. Duke Athletics believes in respect, equality, and inclusiveness, and we do not tolerate hate and bias. Hashtag hate won't live here, because, adding that hashtag really just made them 100% right. So this is Duke's VP and Director of Athletics basically saying, BYU, you're wrong, we're right. You might have done an investigation and now have evidence, but like you said, we believe and we feel that our players would never lie about this.
Well, let's be clear. No one has actually even claimed that. None of the Duke players have even claimed this. The Duke players
were interviewed. Yeah, apparently,
Duke was part of this investigation. I mean, we're living in a fairy tale here. This is a fantasy world.
Yeah.
By the way, I want to mention one of the sounds like a small point, but you mentioned the hashtag that the Duke athletic department official used. That is used on a T-shirt that Duke created in the aftermath of this, yep. Which I'm sure they're selling. In the NIL era, I'll bet Rachel Richardson is going to get a cut of that T-shirt.
LeBron's probably signing her somewhere right now.
Yeah,
Colin Kaepernick's jumping on and grabbing her somewhere.
Right. I mean, and so there's a financial element to that as well as the absurdity of the statement itself, especially when Duke actively participated in the investigation, and there's no facts. There are no facts in that statement at all. And but this is, to me, that's one of the fascinating elements of this story. It's also one of the depressing elements of the story, is that it really goes to the essence of why our institutions are so broken, why our media is so broken, why academia is so broken, why we are so divided, why we can believe whatever we want to believe, facts be damned, on both sides, on all sides. And it's disgusting, and it's almost the exact opposite of what used to make this country great. The United States of America. We can't agree on anything anymore.
No.
And nothing, literally nothing. And it's sad. And it's so dangerous. This sounds like a trivial story because it's a women's college volleyball game. But I'm telling you, this is a very significant story because of what it reveals about our culture and our country.
And I don't know about you, John, but part of me kind of feels bad for this young lady because she was obviously raised in this worldview. She's obviously a gifted athlete. You're playing at Duke University volleyball. It's a high-level volleyball team. It's Division I, major university. And now your whole, you have just put yourself in this box. You are now forever going to be known as Rachel Richardson, another one like a Jussie Smollett race hoaxer. And she really didn't even do it. She's now just going with it. But it was kind of put upon her, and now she's right. She's not denying her godmother. Like, part of me, she's a young lady.
I'm going to disagree with you.
Decision right there.
I'm going to disagree with you slightly. I think that was the case for the first 36 hours of this story.
Now it's not.
but now it's that's no longer the case. I mean, she has jumped in and she's trying to take advantage of this. And again, I'd love to know whether or not she's making any money from those T-shirts. And she did an ESPN interview, which was completely unconvincing, by the way. And that's another element of this story, which is amazing. She did an interview with Holly Rowe, a woman that I've met fairly recently and exchanged emails with, tried to warn about this story that I thought it was not true. She didn't even bother to respond to me, which is completely unprofessional. And she blocked me on Twitter, which is incredibly unprofessional.
Oh boy, the Twitter block. Oh boy.
Right. I mean, talk about, making a statement that you do not want to hear anything that's going to burst your bubble, which is the opposite of what journalism is supposed to be. But Holly Rowe does this interview, the only, to my knowledge, video interview that Richardson has done, tossing softballs at her, no skepticism whatsoever. But to me, the Richardson interview was completely inconsistent with this story being true. If this story had been true, there would be emotion, there would be anger, there were some details, but not specifics even about what was said. There was, and so to me, and she was praised for her demeanor. Oh, she's so classy. No, maybe she's being classy and saying that, BYU, she doesn't think ill of BYU for this. Maybe she's saying that because it didn't really happen.
Probably.
I mean, have you ever considered that possibility, you morons?
And John, I listened to your interview with Glenn on the show and I really enjoyed it. And I forget which one of you brought this up, but it kind of resonated with me. The broader scale of this accusation and all the details that we know basically says that every single person in that stadium, because if, or anyone within earshot there, which was a packed stadium, apparently packed arena, are racist because none of them stepped up and said anything. Right. The coaches, if they found out about this, are cowardly or also racist because, John, you've coached before. I've coached at a high school level, youth level, and whatever. And if this was going on with one of my athletes and they came up to me and told me, the first thing I'd be doing is pulling the officials over and saying, hey, we need to get this checked or otherwise I'm taking my kids off the field because this is, this is unsportsmanlike. Get this under control.
Right.
And you would think that a high level, a professional coach would do that if this was going on.
But if
someone told them that.
But you're missing.
And in 2022.
Okay, but you're missing, or at least you haven't mentioned yet, because neither of us have, one of the key elements of the story. And this is part of going back to the beginning of this, why I immediately smelled a rat. And that is that BYU is too perfect a target for this story.
They certainly are.
Because they are mostly white, although there were black basketball players in the student section of that crowd that night. And they are mostly Mormon. And the media believes that a mostly white Mormon crowd is capable of anything. That strain of argument that you just gave has no impact on a New York media member because they think, well, no, they're just all circling the wagons to protect their fellow white Mormons, which is ludicrous if you know anything about the reality of it. And by the way, I don't want to leave the Holly Rowe situation because this goes to just how broken the news media is. I did not even realize this until a day or two after she did the interview with Richardson, but Holly Rowe has a conflict of interest that should have prevented her from ever being part of the story. Holly Rowe originally went to college at BYU.
Wow.
But she got kicked out of school there.
Oh.
So here she is, and she ends up going and graduating from another school in Utah. So this is a woman who has a clear animus towards BYU. And I can't prove why she was kicked out. I've heard some interesting stories about that may have even been somewhat, relevant to this case, not specifically, but the issues involved in this case, which would have even further elevated the conflict of interest. Wow. But the idea that Holly Rowe ends up being the person who, and by the way, Holly Rowe's Twitter feed, where she's blocked me, her picture her header is a picture of her hugging Oprah. So this is not a woman that's going to be skeptical of a black female victim of alleged racism by a school that kicked her out. I mean, come on. It's just not going to happen. So,
they wouldn't have dared put Sage Steele to do this interview because they know Sage would have actually asked some questions.
That's a great question. I would love for Sage Steele to do the interview with Rachel Richardson.
She's so fantastic. I love Sage Steele.
Obviously, being a black woman, she would have the ability to go, come on, girl, wait a minute. You're going to tell me
this doesn't fit this timeline. This doesn't work. Why didn't you do this? Yeah, no. Right. So before we jump into your podcast series, which I certainly want to talk about, you called out Jay Billis quite explicitly on Twitter, quoting his tweet where he completely and totally backs Duke. Even after all of this has come out, have you heard anything at all back from Jay Billis? or anything from anybody around his circle or anything that he's planning on apologizing for coming to Russia or doing anything like that? Because he's completely wrong. And I don't mind Jay. I think Jay's a decent analyst, but here he's completely wrong.
Well, first of all, obviously I've not heard from Jay or anyone else. Interestingly, I have a similar background with Jay as I do with Holly Rowe. I have spoken to Jay for, in my recollection, at least a half hour about the issues related to the Penn State, Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky case, which we're about to get into, because Jay was very, very anti Penn State and Paterno. And I wanted to try to appeal to Jay because Jay had kept an open mind on Duke lacrosse. And it turned out that Duke lacrosse was a fraud. And it was astonishing to me how closed-minded he was on Penn State in comparison, shockingly, to what he was on Duke lacrosse, because he's a Duke grad. And you know, what I've learned a lot over the years about media figures like Jay Bilas. Jay Bilas is all about Jay Bilas. And as a white male, you must, if you work at ESPN, you must take every PC position there is.
Yeah, look at Will Kane. Will Kane got shoved out of there for not being that. Exactly.
Right. So you know, it is in his interest, especially as a Dookie, to take the position. He could have said nothing, I guess. But if you're going to take a position, I mean, he likes to pretend that he's, you know, a brave voice of the intelligent commentator. And I don't think he's a dumb guy. I just think he's a coward, and he's selfish, and it's all about Jay. But that's the way ESPN works now. I mean, you know, the only people that can have a contrarian opinion on anything are the black commentators, and very few of them they're all woke. They're not gonna. No one is gonna cross Rachel Richardson, especially now that she's a rubber stamped, heroine. I mean, literally, USA Today called her a hero in a headline, and then their columnist who did that, Mike Freeman, doubled down and wrote another column claiming that the theory that this didn't happen is a right-wing conspiracy.
They can't admit that they're wrong. We know that part of being a wokie is you don't admit that you're wrong. You just double down and then you move on to the next one. That's how it works. You just move on. You double down and you move on. That's it.
We've seen that with mask mandates and vaccine mandates that neither of which worked.
No, John, just get the next booster. It'll work this time. I promise.
Yeah. So, I mean, so I have no affection for Jay Bilas. I was very disappointed in my interaction with him, and I was not surprised by the way he handled this story.
All right, so let's jump out of that and let's jump into something that we hinted at a few times. You have a podcast series again named with the Benefit of Hindsight, the true story of the Penn State Scandal, and this is talking about the Jerry Sandusky scandal, where he was accused of being a pedophile and raping. I don't even know how many anymore. This was 11 years ago now. So I was, when this all broke, a junior in college, maybe. So early 20s. And I just remember, and when this went on, I remember the emotion. It kind of, the media did a great job of making this an emotional thing. Now, I was always conflicted about this, John, because when it came to Sandusky, when you hear he is sodomizing young boys, and especially young boys that they're in the second mile program, so they are, being given another chance, given a little more help because things have gone wrong, and he's taking advantage of individuals that need a hand. That just it's hard to not have an emotional response to that, right? When it came to the Joe Paterno thing, I always have kind of stood that they're just railroading this guy because he's the guy that everyone looks up to. And just a lot of the things that came out about Joe Pa, I thought stunk to high heaven. And I've defended Joe Pa a good amount of times. I've obviously made jokes because I think we've all kind of joked around a little bit about the whole thing. But, the Joe Pa side of it has always kind of torn at me. And listening to your podcast has kind of confirmed some of the theories that I've thought about the Joe Pa thing. But I want you to go into kind of why did you jump into this? Because you're not a Penn State fan. You're not a Joe Pa guy. You didn't go to Penn State. You're a Georgetown guy. You're a Notre Dame fan, which I think after today you might not be too happy with the game. What made you jump into this? Why did you sit there and go into this and go, something stinks here, I need to go in and look some more?
Well, my wife asks that question almost every day after over 10 years of this. And so you would think I'd have a really good answer. Basically what happened is that in 2011, when the story broke, I'm a documentary filmmaker who had been pretty well known in conservative circles at that point. I mean, I had a film that debuted on the Today Show in a primetime interview with Matt Lauer about the 2008 election called Media Malpractice. And, I had a legitimate career as a conservative documentary filmmaker. And I had become an expert in the news media, already worked in many, many different elements of the news media, including being a television sportscaster. And I had grown up in Pennsylvania in the Philadelphia suburbs. So I was obviously very well aware of Penn State and Joe Paterno and even Jerry Sandusky.
Yep.
But I was not, as you said, a Penn State fan. In fact, the only Penn State game I ever went to was a Penn State Temple game at the old Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia, and I was rooting for Temple. So I mean, it's not like this had anything to do with love of Joe Paterno, which a lot of people automatically presume, oh, you must be a Joe Paterno fan. Well, I mean, I admired what he did, but I
want to stop there. At that point, before all the scandal came out, as Joe Pa's star rose, it comes from right now. We all kind of still hate Nick Saban because Nick Saban is still winning everything. But as Nick Saban gets towards the twilight and he starts to edge towards all these records and doing all this stuff, there's just a time where you just have to respect greatness. And Joe Pa was at that point where love him or hate him, rival. He's kind of at that Coach Krzyzewski point there where you respect the guy. You appreciate watching greatness.
And I know this is far afield of the podcast, but I do think I've always found it interesting. There's so many elements of the perfect storm here, and there's so many elements of my life that ended up being incredibly well suited for me to be the person to take this on. But a small one was that I remember having conversations with friends of mine who went to Penn State. This is before the scandal. And looking what was going on with Joe Paterno, who was, well into his 80s and at times infirmed and clearly not really coaching the team anymore, as he was heading for the all-time record for most wins in the history of college football. I remember specifically saying, this is not going to end well. And having no idea how catastrophically it was going to end. But I do think that my instincts there were relevant because I mentioned the perfect storm. There's 1,000 elements of the perfect storm in the story. One of them is Joe Paterno not retiring. If Joe Paterno had retired when he should have, which would probably have been at least a couple years before 2011, we never hear of this story, period. And Jerry Sandusky, in my very strong opinion, is playing golf today. Without any charges, no arrest, no nothing. And you have to understand the nature of the case, the nature of the timeline, the impact of Joe Paterno, how important he was to the media angle of this story. When Jerry Sandusky is arrested on that first weekend in November 2011, and I think the prosecution was a bit upset by this and surprised by this. Penn State is not playing that weekend. They have off that weekend. Joe Paterno had just become the winningest coach in the history of college football the previous weekend. No one cared about the story. The national media reported it as a footnote. Oh, by the way, isn't this interesting? You might recall this guy by the name of Jerry Sandusky. He was a Penn State assistant coach, 1986 national championship game, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, he got arrested. That's weird. Okay, let's go back to the game. Yep. I mean, that was the general. By the way, in Sports Illustrated, I've always used this as the proof of my argument. Sports Illustrated, which back then was still a legitimate, magazine, they would go to bed on Monday afternoons. So Jerry gets arrested. The charges come down that Friday night. He's arrested Saturday. The story breaks over the weekend. By Monday afternoon, Sports Illustrated does not have one news story about Penn State Sandusky in their next edition. They have a column at the end of the magazine that reads as if it's the last you're ever going to hear of this story. Oh, wow. We got fooled by this guy, Jerry Sandusky. This is terrible, blah, blah, blah. By the next week, it's the cover of Sports Illustrated, and it's almost the entire magazine. What changed? What changed was it became a Joe Paterno story. It was not a Joe Paterno story until ESPN made it a Joe Paterno story during a very slow news week. Nothing was going on in that week of November. Baseball had ended. The NBA was on strike. Obviously, football's in its playoff lull. No one cares about hockey. College basketball hasn't started yet. This is a very slow week during the November ratings period.
Yep.
And they all of a sudden look around and they go, wait a minute. This grand jury presentment, if you read it the way we'd like to read it, it kind of implicates Joe Paterno here, because Joe Paterno was supposedly told about the rape of a child, and all he did was tell his superior. Wait a minute. Now, this is a gold story. Now, this is a Greek tragedy. This is the bringing down of not just a football legend, but a guy who was deemed to be the pinnacle of all that was good in sports.
Yep.
I mean, so it's, if this had been, I've always said one of the many, again, elements of the perfect storm here, if this had happened at Florida State or Miami or, one of the programs
USC or something like that.
Yeah. One of those programs that's used to scandal where they've had every virus imaginable. They've been inoculated against all these. They would have survived. Penn State had never had any scandal. Nope. In the 50 years of Joe Paterno being there. They had no immunity to any viruses. So they get this virus and they immediately keel over and die because
Joe Pa was Penn State. He created that. Right. Penn State was not a powerhouse before Joe Pa, and they weren't a powerhouse in the beginning of Joe Pa. He really worked his tail off to make them who they are. Right. And it's definitely a shock to that.
So
university.
I know we're running out of time here, but I want to tell the general story here of how I got involved and what I think happened here, because when I got involved, I had no concept that I would, one, be on this 10 years later, and two, that I would be focused more on Jerry Sandusky than I was on Joe Paterno. The Joe Paterno angle of the story never made any damn sense. Let's go back to BYU Duke. I mean, Joe Paterno being told of a rape of a child in a Penn State shower by a former assistant coach, which is what Jerry Sandusky was at the time, and doing nothing about it is impossible. That's at 100. On my point scale, that's at 100. There's now, strange things happen. O.J. Simpson killed 2 people. That was bizarre. But guess what? There's massive amounts of evidence indicating O.J. Simpson killed 2 people. So I'm not suggesting that strange things don't happen. I'm saying that when strange things happen, they come with evidence. And so I immediately decide, okay, I'm going to look into this. This story smells to high heaven from the Joe Paterno angle. I did a documentary film about it, which is still pretty darn good. It's probably still closer to the truth of what actually happened than anything the news media has done in 10 years past.
And that one dramatization they did on ESPN about the whole entire situation where they had the actor playing Joe Pa. Do you remember they did that on ESPN? They had the whole drama. They did like a whole dramatization of the Joe Pa's moments during the Sandusky thing. It was
really, I don't think I ever saw that.
Maybe
I know that. HBO did the Al Pacino movie, which was
that might have been
awful.
It. That's maybe not ESPN. That's what I was thinking. The Al Pacino one. Yeah.
The Al Pacino movie was terrible.
No, it wasn't good at all.
Okay, but anyway, the point of this is, for me, this starts as a Joe Paterno story. And I immediately realized, wait a minute, my gut instinct is correct. This Joe Paterno angle is BS. And then if you take apart the Joe Paterno angle, now you have to question the Penn State cover-up. And as I got deeper into the so-called Penn State cover-up with the 3 administrators, Graham Spanier, who I've gotten to know exceedingly well, he has a brand new book out right now, which apparently praises me, which is nice. And he and I have battled quite a bit over the last several years, especially since his trial, where he was absurdly convicted of misdemeanor. Gary Schultz, who I've done the only extensive interviews he's ever done publicly, and he now believes Jerry Sandusky is innocent. That's part of the podcast. And Tim Curley, an administrator who's never spoken to anyone, probably never will speak to anyone, because I think this case has crushed him. But if you look at the supposed cover-up, once you realize that also is completely devoid of any rationality or evidence, in my view, and this is where, apparently you haven't been 100% convinced yet that Jerry Sandusky is innocent.
I had to finish it.
Okay, one of the many questions I'll ask people is, okay, if you don't buy that Joe Paterno and the Penn State administrators were involved actively in a cover-up of Jerry Sandusky, how can you possibly believe in his guilt? And here's why. Number one, the same people, the same prosecutors who told you Jerry was guilty are the ones that are totally wrong about Penn State covering this up. So right away, their credibility should be shot. Number two, how does Jerry Sandusky get away with this for 40-some years without an institutional cover-up? He's a moron, Jerry Sandusky. I've gotten to know him exceedingly well. He is a naif. He is the least, the furthest thing from a criminal mastermind you could possibly imagine. And I know this. People might say, well, maybe he's putting on an act for you. No. I know this because he was the same guy when I was trying to get him to confess in my interview in prison, where I was guaranteed he would confess by a supposed sex crimes expert who's actually a fraud by the name of Jim Clemente. He's the same guy when I was on that side of the fence as he was and has been for the last 8 or 9 years since I was on the other side of the fence trying to get him out of prison. He's the same naif. He's the same moron. He's the same guy making terrible tactical decisions. I have no idea how he was a top-notch defensive coordinator, either in his strategic thinking or, by the way, he's an incredibly slow talker. That's what got him in trouble in the Bob Costas interview. And so I just don't, I really am baffled by his whole Penn State career and how it happened. But that's not really, directly relevant to the essence of the story. And the essence of the story is that, the big lie here, and it took me years to figure this out. The big lie here is not only was there no cover up, there was nothing to cover up. There's no crime here. I'm not defending pedophilia, child abuse. I have 2 young daughters. That should all go without saying. I'm telling you, there's no evidence where there should be massive amounts of evidence. Massive. And there's nothing. There's no logic. There's no normal MO. This case is totally different than any other serial pedophile in so many ways. No one has ever been able to find me. And I please, if you can find it, please show it to me. Find me another serial pedophile in the modern age without any of the following aspects to the case. 0 pornography. 0. That's unheard of right there. Right there, it is unheard of for there to be no pornography at all in any way, shape, or form. There was no plying with alcohol, no plying with drugs, no attempted payoffs. So many of these cases, there's at least an attempted payoff when it looks like the perpetrator is about to be brought to justice. Yeah, nothing like that happened. There were no contemporaneous reports. There's no DNA. Obviously, there's no nothing. There's no tape recording. By the way, they tape recorded his conversations with victim number 1, Aaron Fisher. None of those ever got put into evidence. Gee, I wonder why. Because they weren't helpful at all to the prosecution. And every single one, and people need to understand, because I understand what happens here is in the mindset of the media and the public, there were so many accusers, they can't possibly all be lying. And I say, well, 2 things. Like with BYU Duke, let's go to the timeline. Timeline is incredibly important. They didn't all just show up one day at the police station and say, "Oh my God, we were molested by Jerry Sandusky.
This is kind of like Deshaun Watson right now with all the things going on with him. It's very, I find that there's close. But it's not direct correlations, but in terms of the pylon of accusers is kind of in a similar sense where they're just kind of not all popping up at once. It's not the aha moment type of deal.
Well, I do think there's some differences that are important in the timeline there, and obviously in the accusations. But let's just be clear here. He was arrested. Jerry Sandusky was at the end of a 3-year grand jury investigation. 3 years. Now, right there in a rational world makes you go, wait a minute, hold on a second.
Isn't there a statute to something like that?
Why did it take 3 years to get an indictment? In fact, in the upside down world that occurred during the nuclear media explosion, there were people that were asking that question from the other direction. Wait a minute. Why did you slow walk this investigation? Why did it take so long? Why are you protecting Jerry Sandusky? Why is he allowed on the streets for 3 years while he's a pedophile? No, it would happen that way because they had no goddamn evidence, because he was, as bizarre as it sounds to people who have not followed the case, he was innocent.
So, John, I have to say real quick, one of the things that opened up my eyes while listening to the show, and one of the things I think is a misconception to this day, is that when you're hearing all this going on in real time and you're hearing everything going on, a lot of people were saying, well, we know Penn State's just going to try to clear their name. They're just going to work hard to try and protect Joe Pa, protect their own, and they're going to clear their name. And then you listen to your podcast, and very early on in the first few episodes, you go, that narrative is completely wrong. Penn State's interest in that this has to be true because they leaned in so early and so heavily on the side of the accusation that didn't have much evidence or basis right away. And they leaned in so heavily that it was in their best interest for this to be true, which to me is what kind of perked me up and really going, I never thought of that. Wait a minute. Like, it's a pretty bizarre thing when you really think about it. And when you said that, I was like, wow, he's not.
I'm glad you mentioned that. And again, it goes back to the BYU situation where you have to understand the way academia works, and you have to understand human self-interest. I'm a huge believer. It's probably my greatest, if I have an expertise, it's in determining what the self-interests of individuals and groups really are. The media is terrible at understanding true self-interest. They often get it 180 degrees wrong. And what you just articulated is a great example of that. People think Penn State paying out $130 million to accusers and firing Joe Paterno and Graham Spanier, that they were pleading guilty, that this means it must be true because otherwise Penn State would be defending Joe Paterno. Baloney. You have to understand the nature of the moral panic, the nature of the media coverage, and you have to understand the dynamics of what was going on at Penn State. And you have a governor, Tom Corbett at the time, a Republican, I'm a Republican, who was dead set on attacking a very liberal president in Graham Spanier. That is a key. I know Graham believes it was the key to the whole case. I think he understandably overinflates that because it was, related to him and destroyed his life. So I get why he does that. But that was a key element to this. So Corbett wants Spanier. And I'm not a conspiracy guy at all. I'm an anti-conspiracy person. But people do pursue their own self-interest, and occasionally they create alliances. And there was the vice chairman of the Penn State Board of Trustees, John Surma, who was the head of U.S. Steel at the time in Pittsburgh, a very important person. He wanted Joe Paterno. He wanted Paterno for years. In fact, Graham Spanier, in our first conversation I ever had with Graham Spanier, I've had dozens for hours with Graham Spanier over the last 10 years. First conversation, he says to me, somewhat naively and innocently, he says, I was always wondering why every year John Surma was asking me, when are we going to fire Joe Paterno?
And go into the reason why, because it's kind of a ridiculous reason why John Surma was going after Joe Pa. I think it's kind of a childish reason why he was so out for him.
Well, this is interpretation, but I don't think it's a stretch. John Surma has a brother, Vic Surma, who played at Penn State for Joe Paterno and was a big Joe Paterno fan for a while until Vic Surma's son This is the problem with Paterno being there for 50 years.
Yep.
When you're at a place for 50 years as the head coach, you're going to piss some people off.
Oh yeah.
Even fans of yours. And so the Surma family goes from being a big supporters of Joe Paterno to being huge opponents because they don't think that Vic Surma's son was treated properly by Joe. Now, my understanding is that Vic Surma's son was a white wide receiver who wasn't very good, and Joe basically said he's not very good, and he ends unfortunately, his son ends up ODing. The nephew ends up ODing and had a very tumultuous life before he OD'd. And they blame Joe Paterno, as bizarre as that is, for that. And that episode, the episode with the nephew, turned the Surmas against Joe Paterno. Mm-hmm. Now, and so, and I have to say, my gut instincts have been really good on this story since moment one when they announced Joe Paterno's firing. My spidey senses were immediately going up. I was, first of all, outraged that this was happening because I knew there's no way it was justified. And I knew it was a panic. Mm-hmm. And I did not trust the people that were making the decisions. But the number one thing that made no sense was the vice chairman of the board is making the announcement. That's John Surma. The vice chairman, not the chairman. Steve Garvin was the chairman. Steve Garvin was in row 3. Sitting quietly behind it. I'm like, what? My father has been on every board there is at Georgetown University. Mm-hmm. And that really helped edify me to what was going to happen here, because I know that my father, God bless him, would never have fought against the New York Times in a panic situation. He would have done whatever the New York Times told him to do. And and academia, Georgetown, I'm sure would have capitulated just like Penn State if a former John Thompson assistant had been caught up in a situation like this. Yep. But when I saw that, I'm like, wait a minute. There's just been a coup here. The vice chairman, this is the most important thing that the board of trustees at Penn State has ever done by a mile. By a mile, this is the most important decision they've ever made. And it's being announced by the vice chairman. Something doesn't make sense here. Well, we now know all these years later that Surma and Corbett were in an alliance. Corbett wanted Spanier, Surma wanted Paterno. The old never let a good crisis go to waste phrase was put into action, and they decided to finally get rid of Joe Paterno. Surma decided to get rid of Joe Paterno. Corbett got rid of Spanier. And the result of that was that once Paterno and Spanier are fired, understandably, the entire public and the entire community of State College presumes Jerry Sandusky must be guilty.
Yep,
because
100%.
How in the world would you possibly fire your legendary head football coach and your respected president if the guy wasn't at least guilty? Mm-hmm. So they're completely making it impossible for Jerry Sandusky to get a fair trial. They're, by the way, making it impossible for Spanier, Curley, and Schultz to get a fair trial because their employers are effectively pleading guilty on their behalf. And then Penn State is deeply, deeply, deeply invested in not having been wrong. Because can you imagine what would have happened to those Penn State Board of Trustees members if 7 months after the firing of Joe Paterno, there's a trial, which, by the way, is record time, no continuances. I mean, if there was a conspiracy in this case, it was a conspiracy to make sure Jerry Sandusky was convicted in enough time so that Louis Freeh could come out and the NCAA could come out before football season started in 2012. That was a conspiracy, and there are emails to prove that. And it's absolutely outrageous that due process was thrown aside. It's unheard of to face a trial 7 months after arrest in a case where there's 10 accusations against you. It's just completely absurd. But the reality here is that had that trial happened and Jerry Sandusky found not guilty, and on all accounts, the members of the Penn State Board of Trustees, because now, by the way, Joe Paterno is dead. Yep. That's an incredibly important part of the timeline here. Paterno dies like a month and a half, 2 months after the scandal hits. And so that Penn State Board of Trustees, if Jerry Sandusky was to be found not guilty on all counts after firing Paterno and Spanier, there would have been tarring and feathering in the streets.
Oh, yeah.
Of those board members. And they would have been seen as the people that not just destroyed Joe Paterno's legacy, they killed him because he died just after that. And by the way, it's also incredibly important to point out in the timeline here, that game where he was fired just before it happened was supposed to be the great celebration of his career. It was going to be his last home game. He had just been they just attained the status as the winningest coach in the history of college football. And it was going to be Penn State, Nebraska. And that game, that game being on ESPN played an incredibly important role here because it gave ESPN a pressure point during that critical week where they can point all week long to this game is going to be on our air. And can you believe that Joe Paterno was going to be on the sidelines for that after Jerry Sandusky was just arrested on these horrendous charges? And that is why Penn State panicked. If Penn State was on the road that week, or if they weren't playing that week, I would like to believe Penn State would not have panicked and they would not have fired Paterno and Spanier. And there would have been some time to at least take a breath, look at the facts, think about this for a second. Instead, there was total moral panic. And the decisions that were made were not based in facts, evidence, or logic. And our podcast, with the benefit of hindsight, believe it or not, and I don't know it's impossible to know what the exact conversion rate is. And I'm disappointed you're not in 100% yet.
I'm sorry.
But I would say, based upon the reaction I get on Twitter and emails and Facebook, I would say that well over 90% of people who listen to this entire podcast, and it's a hell of a podcast. It's a long ride, folks. Buckle up.
It's been fun.
I would say that at least 90% of people who listen to the entire podcast with the benefit of hindsight end up concluding that not only is Jerry Sandusky innocent, it's not even close. And that's the most amazing part of this whole thing. It's not even close. I am more confident that Jerry Sandusky is innocent of ever having committed child abuse than I am that Rachel Richardson was not racially heckled by BYU fans. That's how confident I am.
That's incredible. So before we kind of go, because you've been incredibly generous with your time, and I appreciate it, John, that you're hanging around. Because we're going to completely skip a last portion that I wanted to talk about, and I certainly want to have you on again to talk a little more about the media aspect completely, because you do know the media side very well. So I certainly want to have you on another time. But before we go, I do have to ask you, since you released the full-fledged of the podcast in 2021, I believe is the whole time that you released it, what has been kind of the response, kind of people that are coming down on you and saying that, you're completely wrong and you're just defending a pedophile, and versus those who have listened and been like you said, you're completely right? Have you had any high-profile people that listen full through and it's like, we've been wrong? Because obviously the media that wants this story to continue to be true is going to not listen and smear you, because that's what they do. They don't listen, they don't read, and then they smear. But so what has been kind of the both sides there that you found that people have been going against it or going with it?
I have been pleasantly surprised by the number of people that have been willing to give this the commitment that it requires to listen to the entire podcast. So that, number one, that's been good. And I would say I've gotten, I don't know how many, but it's dozens and dozens of incredibly heartfelt, detailed emails saying, I can't believe I'm writing this. I never thought this was possible, but thank you for opening my eyes to what really happened. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but I mean, I've gotten so many responses like that. I would say that, there are people on Twitter that are debating about this from my perspective almost 24/7 now, because there are people that are that totally convinced that this is the greatest legal travesty of our time again. And it's not even close. It's not like people are thinking, well, gee, this case wasn't proven or he could be innocent. No. We prove this. It's almost impossible to prove a negative I believe we do. I believe we go into such great detail that it is impossible to believe that Jerry Sandusky is guilty after listening to the full podcast, because we go into so many different. We cover every single possible base that there is, and part of the reason why we have episodes that are sometimes 4 and 5 hours long is because I know the incredibly high burden of proof that I'm held to on this case, and so therefore, when I make a statement, I know that I need to build a massive wall around that, a wall of facts around each statement, because otherwise, if one of those statements falls apart, then my whole argument might be, alleged to have done the same. So, and my co-host Liz Abib, who's a former TV sportscaster here in Los Angeles for the Fox affiliate, and is actually and now part of academia. She's been a professor at Syracuse University Newhouse School and the Walter Cronkite Journalism School, and so she is a Pitt grad, and she started all of this thinking I was crazy, and now she believes with almost the same certitude that I do that Jerry Sandusky is innocent. So I would say that the listener reaction has been quite gratifying, a little bit surprising, mainly because I just didn't think people would still be this interested in the case and have this level of commitment to it this many years later. But I will say it's a very compelling podcast, and it goes way beyond just the Penn State story. You're going to learn so much about life, so much about the media. And by the way, you're going to understand, this sounds crazy, you're going to understand what happened with COVID a lot better when you listen to this podcast. In
That's
my
incredible.
Opinion. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but I truly believe I was one of the first that called exactly how COVID was going to go down. And it's because I saw so many of the same parallels to the Penn State Sandusky case. You have a panic. You have an unprecedented situation. People don't have any reference point. You have experts claiming they know what's good, what's right. You have people afraid who aren't willing to follow their own instincts because they're told their instincts are wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were people at the beginning of the story that at first, I don't know what the percentage is, but there was a good amount of people that looked at this story and said, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right. Not just from the Paterno aspect, but even from the Sandusky aspect. Well, those people got so intimidated and so drowned out that they stopped being willing to speak out.
And in the beginning, there were a bunch of second mile. Yeah, there were a bunch of second mile kids. I believe that's what it's called, if I'm getting it wrong. But
no, second mile's the charity.
Yeah, there was a bunch of people that were in second mile that I remember were coming out and saying, this does not sound true. I know Jerry Sand, I know him. He's been a father figure to me, this and that. And they did disappear pretty quickly. I have to say, maybe the first few weeks, there was a good amount of them coming out and saying, and they were getting destroyed for coming out and saying these things.
And they were very similar to the medical professionals that were saying, wait a minute, we're totally overreacting to COVID here.
This is a coronavirus. We've seen these forever.
Right. Or that masks don't work, or that why are we mandating a vaccine that doesn't stop transmission? I mean, it's the same basic concept. And once you are perceived as either being pro pedophilia or pro a virus that's killing millions of people, you're done, right? I mean, most people are just going to say, "I'm sorry, I'm going to go away now," because most people don't have that kind of skin, and they certainly don't have that kind of a platform. I mean, they're not going to be given a platform by the media when the media, as they were with COVID and they were with Sandusky, is 100% on one side of the story. You should always question when the media is universally on one side of a story, because almost no story is without complexity.
Have you gotten any positive feedback from media outlets about your podcast? From media outlets coming out and saying there
have been people in the media, no major figures, but there have been people in the media who have listened to the podcast and are incredibly impressed and convinced. Yes.
Good. Well, I will spread the word to anyone I know that's interested, especially in this, to listen to it, because I've been compelled and it's been interesting, and I'll let you know when I finish it 100%. And I'll tell you, it seems that this way, as I'm leaning towards, I might be in that 90 percentile with what I've been hearing, but I do recommend it highly to anybody. John, I really appreciate you coming on the show. I wish we had more time because I have plenty more I want to talk to you about, but I really appreciate you coming on.
All right. Let me know when I get you to 100% on Sandusky's innocence.
Absolutely. Again, he's John Ziegler. He's a man of many hats in the media, senior columnist, talk show radio host, a documentary filmmaker, and author. And as we've just been talking about, he's the host of With the Benefit of Hindsight, the true story of the Penn State scandal. Someone that is very big on this. John, do you have anywhere you want to shout out, any social media that you want to tell everyone to go follow you?
I'm very active on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is a terrible college nickname, which is Zigman, Zigman, Zigman Freud. So at Zigman Freud, just look up John Ziegler, Ziegler, and you'll find me.
Awesome. Again, thank you everyone for listening. I really appreciate everyone listening to the podcast. John, once again, thank you for coming on. Everybody, so long.